My wolf had been silent for 20 years. Not broken. I want to be clear about that. Saren was not diminished or grieving in the way that some wolves become after a young king's reckless choices hollow them out. He was simply quiet, contained, a great gray presence behind my ribs that advised me in the way a very old counselor advises, not with speeches, but with a held stillness, a particular warmth behind the eyes, a posture that said, "Not yet." Or, "Yes," without a single sound passing between us. He had been my father's wolf before he was mine, a long-bonded pair, and when my father died it was Saren who stayed, transferred his old and patient heart to the new king, and settled in for the work. I was 18. He was already ancient in wolf years, or at least he behaved as though he were. Dignified, unhurried, never dramatic. So when he first turned his head toward the dyer's quarter on the morning I rode into Thornfeld, I thought nothing of it. He does that sometimes, ears swivel toward a sound, the way all wolves do, a pup's cry, river noise. I was talking to my steward Aldrich, running through the inspection roster for the autumn market, and Saren's ears tipped south and held. I noticed the way I notice weather, registered, then dismissed. 3 days, I said to Aldrich, and dismounted in the inn courtyard. The river dike survey in the morning, the traders' dispute before midday, the pack register in the evening. We keep the schedule and we're home before the frost. Saren sat down in the courtyard and pointed his nose at the south end of the market. "Not you," I told him, and went inside. Thornfeld is a river valley town, low-built and amber-tiled, tucked inside a bend of the Ashwater where it slows and spreads before the eastern gorge. Twice a year, spring planting and autumn harvest, the valley fills up with traders who come down from the northern holds and up from the coastal settlements. Wool merchants, ironworkers, salt traders, seedsmen, and the itinerant cloth-dyers who follow the merchant circuit, setting up their great cauldrons and drying racks in the open yards along the river, and spending 3 weeks turning raw fleece into the deep blues and saffron golds and the particular gray-green that the valley packs favor for their ceremony cloaks. I had inspected the Thornfeld autumn market 7 times since becoming king of Ashvale. It was routine, comfortable even. The valley packs were loyal and orderly. The market disputes were the same disputes in different coats, a border placement argument, a weight measure quarrel, a question of who owed whom a season's rent on a shared stall. I handled them, ate the inn's riverfish, slept well, and went home. I expected this visit to be the same. My wolf had other thoughts, apparently. I heard it before I saw anything. I was crossing the market square on my way to the river dike with Aldrich, and out of the noise of the morning, the calling vendors, the creak of loaded carts, the high clear argument of 2 women over a bolt of cloth, there rose a laugh. Not a polite laugh, not the contained, careful laughter of someone who knows she's in public and manages it. This was a full sound, unguarded and delighted, the kind that catches people nearby and tilts them toward it whether they mean to be tilted or not. 3 strangers within earshot of me grinned involuntarily. A child sitting on a barrel turned his whole body toward the sound. 2 pups, young ones barely above the ground, abandoned whatever scent they'd been tracking and trotted in that direction with their ears up, as if someone had rung a bell they recognized. Saren, at my left side, stopped walking. I looked down at him. He was looking south, toward the dyer's quarter, ears high and forward, every line of him gathered into a point like a hound on a trail. I had not seen him look like that since never actually, not once in 20 years. "Saren," I said. He looked up at me. His eyes, which were the pale amber of old river ice, had something in them that I could only describe as expectancy. Then he looked south again. "The dike survey," I said. He sat down. I told myself it was nothing. A wolf reacting to a crowd sound. Pups react to everything. Grown wolves react to more than people assume. I left Saren with my junior guard, a young man named Baron, who looked mildly alarmed at being assigned to manage a king's wolf, and went to the river dike, which had 3 points of erosion on its eastern bank, and 1 section of stone facing that needed replacing before winter. Useful, concrete, exactly what I'd come for. I came back at midday to find Saren sitting in almost precisely the place I'd left him, facing south, and Baron standing 6 feet behind him with the expression of a man who has spent 2 hours being decisively ignored. "Did he move at all?" I asked. "Once," Baron said carefully. He went to the south end of the square and sat there for about an hour. Then he came back. I looked at Saren. Saren looked at me. Then he looked south. "We have the traders' dispute at midday," I said, to no one in particular. Saren's ears tipped toward the sound of a laugh. The same one, I was almost certain, a thread of it under the market noise. He did not look away from the dyer's quarter. I went to the traders' dispute. Saren came, eventually, when I stopped waiting and simply walked. The matter was straightforward. Two traders from different northern packs had both registered the same stall square, one through a seasonal renewal form filed in spring, and one through a winter carry exemption that the market master had failed to record. I sorted it in an hour, awarded the square to the spring renewal claimant, arranged a partial compensation from the market fund for the other, and sent both away satisfied enough that they wouldn't be back before I left. Aldrich made notes. The market master apologized 7 times in succession. I told him once was sufficient and was already thinking about the pack register meeting when Saren's head came up sharply on my left. The laugh again. It was clearer this time. We were closer to the dyer's quarter, I realized, which ran along the riverbank south of the main square. I could hear the cauldron work, the slosh and pound of the rinse barrels, the chatter of the dye workers as they hauled and sorted, and underneath it, easy and unhurried, a woman's voice describing something to someone. I couldn't catch the words, and then that laugh at the end of whatever she'd said, round and easy as a river stone. 4 pups came out from between the stalls, trailing the sound like thread on a bobbin, and sat themselves down near a gate that opened into the dyer's yard. They looked focused, content, as if they'd arrived somewhere they meant to be. I almost went to look. Then Aldrich said, "Pack register preparations, my lord," and I went back to the inn. That evening, the pack register took 3 hours. It always does. Thornfeld is a crossroads settlement with more transient pack members than most, people who winter here and summer elsewhere, and the register has to account for every wolf in the valley at the time of the market. I sat at the long inn table and went through the lists while the packmasters brought their household rolls, and Aldrich recorded discrepancies. It was necessary work, important work, the kind of work I'm actually good at. Detail, order, the satisfaction of a clean record where there had been a muddled one. When I finally stopped for the evening, I went to the inn's south-facing window out of some impulse I didn't examine, and looked down at the river street below. The dyer's yard was lit by lanterns strung between the drying poles, the wet cloth hanging in long strips of deep color, indigo and madder red, and the cool gray that Ashvale packs love, and there was still someone moving about down there, unhurried in the way people move when they've been at work all day, and the work is nearly done. She was checking the cloth, lifting a corner here, testing the fiber there, moving along the line with a cloth dyer's competence I could recognize even from this distance. Dark braid, practical dress covered by a dyer's apron, dark at the hem from river work. Her hands were stained at the fingers, indigo from the look of it. She said something to someone I couldn't see, got an answer, and laughed. In the room with me, Saren turned his head toward the window and made a sound I had not heard him make in 20 years. Not a whine and not quite a keen. Something between the two, like a wire held at both ends and plucked. It lasted 1 second and then was over, but it filled the room completely. I looked at him. He looked at me with those pale amber eyes. "What are you doing?" I asked him, low. He blinked once, slowly, the way wolves blink when they want you to understand that the answer is obvious and you are the only one in the room who hasn't found it yet. I went to bed. She was everywhere in the market the next morning without ever being directly in front of me. I found evidence of her like a man following tracks. The pups clustered at the gate to the dyer's yard, 3 deep and happy. An old wolf, gray-faced and slow, that should have been resting in the shadow of the pack hall, sitting upright and attentive near the entrance to the river street. 2 young she-wolves from the Valley Eastern pack, who had apparently found reasons to bring their unfinished fleece in for dyeing, 2 days ahead of schedule. A cloth merchant from the northern hold who stopped me in the square to enthuse about the gray-green that had come out of this dyer's cauldrons. "The color's never been so clean, my lord. I've been up this circuit 8 years and I've not seen its like," with a look on his face like a man describing a small miracle. Saren walked the market beside me, and his ears were always tilted south. I told myself I was simply a man who hadn't slept well, reading too much into a wolf's ordinary attentiveness to a busy market. Then midday came, and I crossed the south end of the square at a bad angle, and a gap opened in the crowd. 2 carts pulling apart to let a loaded pack mule through, and she was on the other side of the gap, maybe 20 feet from me, talking to a seedsman. Her back was half turned. I could see the dark braid, and the dye-stained hands, and the easy angle of her head as she considered something the seedsman was showing her, some small packet, that she opened and inspected the way someone inspects something they actually understand, not just politely. She said something. The seedsman looked pleased. She was already turning to go. The crowd closed. She was gone. Saren had stopped walking. He was pointing. There is no other word for it. Every line of him aimed at the place she'd been. And his tail, which had been still for 2 decades, was moving. Just slightly, barely noticeable, but moving. I stood in the middle of the Thornfeld market and stared at my wolf's tail. "Saren," I said quietly, "what is she?" His amber eyes met mine. His tail moved again. I knew what it meant. I had known for 2 days, actually, in the way a man can know a thing and simultaneously refuse to know it because it is large and strange and not in the schedule. My wolf had recognized someone. He had known it before I had, which should not have surprised me. Wolves often do. But I had never expected it to happen in the Thornfeld autumn market, to a cloth-dyer whose name I didn't know, when I had 3 more items on the inspection roster. I turned toward the dyer's quarter. "My lord," Aldrich said. 30 minutes, I said. "I have something to look at." I walked to the river street, which was quieter in the midday hour when the dyers were eating, and stood at the gate of the yard. The cloth hung still in the light air off the water. The cauldrons were banked, steam still rising from 2 of them, the yard empty except for a tabby cat asleep on the warm rim of the largest pot. The workspace was organized in a way that told me something about the person who kept it. Everything had a place, nothing was wasted. The river rinse troughs were tilted to drain efficiently. The dye bottles on the bench were stoppered and arranged by color family. It was the yard of someone who knew what she was doing and cared about doing it well. I was examining the set of the rinse troughs, genuinely curious now. They were angled in a way I hadn't seen before, and it was clearly more efficient. When Saren walked past me, through the open gate, and went directly to the far side of the yard, where he sat down with his back to me. In front of him was a closed door, the dye room, from the smell. He looked at the door. He looked at me. He looked at the door. "Saren," I said, and he looked at me again with an expression of magnificent patience, as if he had been waiting for me to catch up for 2 days, and was prepared to wait longer if necessary. "This is not," I began, and then stopped, because the door opened. She came out with her arms full of a finished bolt of cloth, gray-green, the Ashvale ceremony color, deep and even and clean, the color that had taken the cloth merchant a small paragraph to describe, and she was looking at the cloth and not at the yard, and so she didn't see us immediately. She set the bolt on the workbench, smoothed one hand along the top layer to check the surface, looked satisfied, and then turned around. She saw Saren first. Most people, confronted unexpectedly with a large gray wolf of royal bearing sitting in the middle of their workyard, do one of 3 things: step back, freeze, or call out. She did none of these. She tilted her head at him the way you tilt your head at something interesting and said, "Oh, where did you come from?" Saren looked at her and his tail moved. "That is a beautiful wolf," she said, to no one in particular. Then she looked past him and saw me. I was standing in the gateway of her yard. I had not announced myself. I had no formal reason to be here. The dyer's quarter was not on my inspection roster. I was wearing my traveling coat, not regalia, and I had left my guard at the inn. I was, by any honest measure, a king who had followed his wolf into a strange woman's workyard because Saren had pointed at it. "I apologize for the intrusion," I said. My wolf walked in before I could stop him. She looked at Saren again. Saren, for his part, was sitting in the exact center of her yard and giving no indication of planning to leave. "He doesn't look particularly stopped," she observed. "He rarely is," I said. She picked up a rinse cloth and wiped her hands, an absent, practical gesture, and looked at me with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who is trying to determine if a situation is a problem or merely unusual. She had dark eyes, steadier than I expected. The indigo stain at her fingers had worked into the fingertip creases in the way it does when you've been dyeing for years, not weeks. There was a faint smudge of madder red on her left jaw. "Are you from one of the valley packs?" she asked. Not exactly, I said. The northern holds? No. She considered me. You've the look of a man who's used to being recognized, she said, without any particular emphasis, as if she were simply noting an observable fact about the weather. I felt something in my chest shift. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, not a sudden fire. More the way a key turns in a lock that has been waiting. A small, significant movement with a quiet sound. Saren, in the middle of the yard, let out a long, slow breath and lay down with his chin on his paws, as if he'd been holding that breath for 2 days and could now finally release it. My name is Calder, I said. Something moved in her eyes, the recognition, arriving a half-second late, and then the slight recalibration of a person who has been speaking without ceremony to the Alpha King of Ashvale. To her credit, she didn't stammer or step back. Nara, she said levelly. Nara of the River Circuit. She paused. My lord. Nara, I said, and then I could not think of what else to say, which had not happened to me in 20 years of ruling, and which was apparently Saren's great entertainment, because he lifted his chin off his paws and looked at me with those pale amber eyes, and his tail moved twice. I left before I said something undignified, but I left knowing what he had known since the morning I rode into Thornfeld. The third day began with fire. Not a dangerous fire in the end. I want to say that clearly, because what followed was still frightening in the moment, and I will not soften that. But it could have been worse, and it wasn't. And part of why it wasn't was Nara herself. The dye fire started in the early evening, when a banked cauldron's heat transferred through the stone base to a stored pile of dry mordant fleece that had been set too close. An accident of the kind that happens when a workyard is busy and the second check doesn't get made. The fleece caught, and the fleece was close enough to a rack of hanging dry cloth that the cloth caught too, and within a few minutes there was a serious fire in the south end of the dyer's yard. I heard the alarm from the inn's upper floor. Saren was on his feet before I reached the door. Thornfeld moved well, I'll say that for the valley packs. The water chain from the river was organized in under 3 minutes. The market folk who lived nearest were already pulling cloth and materials away from the burning rack, and the pack's young wolves had cleared the animal pens east of the yard with clean speed. By the time I reached the river street, the fire was contained to the original rack and the yard's south wall, which was stone and would not spread. What wasn't contained was the large rinse barrel that had cracked in the heat, dumping boiling river water and a season's worth of indigo dye across the yard floor. 2 of the young wolves who'd been closest went down on the slick surface. One was back up quickly. The other, a young she-wolf, 14 or 15 at most, her first or second market season by the look of her, had taken the barrel's edge on the back of her shoulder when she fell, and she was sitting on the wet stones unable to stand, her packmates trying to help and adding to the confusion. I came through the gate and got most of the helpers redirected in under a minute. The girl needed stillness and someone who knew what they were doing, not 6 people pulling her in different directions. I was 2 feet away from her and trying to assess the shoulder when Nara came through the east gate of the yard from the opposite direction. She'd been pulling cloth off the east drying poles and had circled around, and saw what I was looking at. She was beside the girl in 4 steps and her hands were already moving, checking the shoulder with a calm, educated pressure that told me immediately she'd done this before. Her whole bearing changed in those seconds. The marked ease, the slight humor I'd noticed the day before, all of it set aside, and what remained was a steadiness that was remarkable in a burning yard with smoke still rising and people shouting. Her collarbone, she said to me, quietly enough that the girl couldn't hear. Not broken. It would have presented differently. Bruised badly. She needs to be still and warm. Can she be moved? Carefully, and on one side only, she looked up at me, smoke and lantern light and the yellow light of the doused fire behind me, and her dark eyes finding mine across the girl's shoulder. And I saw, or felt, rather, the moment the mark registered. Not a blaze, not the dramatic gold fire of the songs, just a warmth on my wrist, so sudden and complete that my hand moved to cover it before I thought about it. Nara's hand had stopped on the girl's shoulder. She looked down at her own wrist. The mark was there, on both of us, the mate mark of a fated bond, showing itself gold pale and steady against our skin, mine at the inner wrist, hers at the same mark, exactly, the way they always are, as if the same hand made them both. The girl between us was looking at us with the wide eyes of someone who has just understood that something large is happening around her that has nothing to do with the fire. Nara began. I know, I said. We'll come back to it. First, let's get her inside. Nara looked at me for one more second, and something in her face was private and uncertain, and I did not press it. She nodded once, and we moved the girl together, carefully, with Nara guiding and me supporting the left side, and we got her into the inn's back room where there was warmth and a healer was already being sent for. The fire was fully out within the half hour. No one else was seriously hurt. The burnt rack and 2 lengths of finished cloth and a section of the yard's south wall were the total damage, which was grievous from a trader's perspective but repairable. Nara's cauldrons were undamaged. The gray-green bolt on the bench was fine. I found her in the inn yard afterward, her apron darkened with ash and river water, standing with her back to the wall and her face turned up to the cold air. The lanterns of the inn hung still around her. The market was settling back into its evening sounds, the alarm and excitement fading to murmur. It was quiet by the time I crossed the yard toward her. She looked at her wrist when she heard my step, then at me. I've heard of this, she said. I didn't expect it to feel like warmth. What did you expect? She thought about it honestly. Something heavier, she said. Something with more warning. My wolf has been warning me for 2 days, I said. I chose not to understand it. The corner of her mouth moved. The wolf in the yard. His name is Saren. He recognized you before I did. I paused. He recognized your laugh, I think, before he'd even seen your face. He's been pointing south since the morning we arrived. She looked out across the inn yard, where Saren was sitting in the middle of the cobblestones, with the particular dignity of an old wolf who has been proved right and is not going to say so. His tail moved once, slowly, when her eyes found him. She laughed. And I heard it, really heard it this time, not filtered through a crowd or carried on market noise, but clean and close, in the quiet of the inn yard, a sound that was warm and slightly surprised and wholly itself, the kind of laugh that has no performance in it at all, only the actual feeling that produced it. It was the sound Saren had turned toward on the first morning. It was the sound the pups had followed and the old wolf had risen for, and the she-wolves had rearranged their work weeks to stay near. It was the sound I had been close to twice and never quite heard until this moment. Saren's tail moved twice more. He looked at me with what I can only describe as relief. I had spent 20 years being a deliberate man, good at waiting, good at assessment, good at the work of a king, which requires more patience than brilliance. I had ruled fairly and, I thought, well, I had not expected this. Not here, not now, not in an autumn market when I was 42, and had nearly stopped believing the mate bond was something that would find me, rather than something I had simply never been suited for. I sat down on the low stone wall of the inn yard. It occurred to me that I was tired, the bone tired of a man who has been holding himself at a careful distance from something for 2 days and can now stop doing that. I owe you an honest account of what this means, I said, and the choice has to be yours. That's not a formality. I mean it. She sat down on the other end of the wall, a careful foot between us, and gave me her full attention. I'm an alpha king, I said. The mate bond, when it takes, and this has taken, I think you can feel that it has. It doesn't dissolve. It settles, it grows, but it does not compel anything. You are not obligated by what's on your wrist. You are not mine because the mark says so. I looked at the gold mark on my own wrist, then at hers. The same. Exactly. I'm asking, not announcing. She was quiet for a moment. The lantern light moved over her face, and I watched her think, the way she'd thought in front of the seedsman's packet, carefully and without pretense. What would it mean? She asked. In practical terms. I have a circuit. This is my work, the dyeing. I'm good at it, and I don't want to stop. I wouldn't ask you to stop. I'd ask you to come home to Ashvale's Hall and work out of there when you're not on circuit. The hall has a dye works. It's been empty for years. It would need setting up. I paused. You'd be queen. That comes with its own considerable demands. I imagine. You'd also be the mate of a man who followed a wolf into your workyard, I said, which may or may not recommend me. She looked at Saren. Saren looked back at her, with his pale amber eyes, steady and warm. He's very dignified for an animal, who was pointing at my shed for 2 days, she said. He has spent 20 years being more dignified than I deserve, I said, and she laughed again, and it settled over the inn yard like something warm laid over cold shoulders, and Saren stood up from his place in the middle of the cobblestones and walked to the wall and sat down between us and put his gray head on her knee. She looked down at him. Her hand moved to his ears, slowly, the way you move when you aren't sure something will allow it and you don't want to startle it. Saren closed his eyes. He didn't wait for permission, she observed. He hasn't waited for much, I said. She looked at the mark on her wrist again, then at mine, then at me. I have 3 more days of the circuit to finish, she said. Ironhaven in the west, and Ashwater Mouth in the south. I can't leave the circuit early. I have obligations, people expecting the cloth. I know, I have obligations of my own. I need to finish the pack register and get back to the hall before the first frost. So, she turned it over. You would go back, and I would finish my circuit, and then you'd come to Ashvale's hall, if you were willing, and we'd do this properly. I looked at her. If you're willing. She was quiet for a long time. Not a frightened quiet, a thinking quiet, the kind that means a person is actually deciding and not performing the decision. I did not hurry it. Saren breathed under her hand, slow and even. What I know now, that I didn't fully understand then, is that Nara had been living on the river circuit for 9 years. She had come to it young, after her mother's pack dispersed. A small valley pack, 3 families that had wound down when the river shifted and the farmland changed, the way small packs sometimes do over a generation. She was not packless in the way of someone cast out or rejected. She was packless in the way of someone whose people had become other things, become individual, and who had found a life that suited the space they'd left. She was not unhappy. She was not waiting for rescue. She was a woman who had made something good from a hand that hadn't been dealt with great generosity, and she was not going to give it up carelessly. That is what I understood, watching her think. She had a great deal to give up, if she chose to say yes. And she was taking the measure of whether the thing she'd receive in exchange was worth it. I respected it. I found, sitting on the inn-yard wall in the lantern light with my wolf's head on her knee, that I was more anxious about what she'd say than I had been about any council meeting or border dispute in recent memory. It was an unfamiliar sensation, not unpleasant. The dye works at Ashvale's hall, she said finally. Is it stone-built? Stone and good timber, I said. West-facing, by the river inlet. The light in the afternoon would be, I thought about it. Actually good, I think. I've never thought about it as a dye works specifically, but the light should be good. She nodded, thinking about light in a room she hadn't seen. I would want to bring my cauldrons, she said. My own equipment. I've spent years getting them seasoned right. Bring everything you own, I said. She looked at me. Everything I own isn't very much, by the standard of a king's hall. Then it will take very little space, I said. And there is a great deal of space at Ashvale's hall. Her mouth curved, just slightly. Not the full laugh, something smaller, private. She looked at Saren's gray head on her knee. He was, to all appearances, asleep, but one amber eye opened briefly at her attention, then closed again. He really has been pointing at my shed for 2 days, she said. Since the morning we arrived, I said. He heard your laugh before I'd seen your face. He knew before I did. She considered this for a long moment. Then she said, It seems ungracious to refuse a wolf who made up his mind that thoroughly. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was held. Is that a yes? She looked at me directly, with the same steady dark eyes that had met mine over the girl's shoulder in the burning yard, with the smoke and the firelight between us. It's a yes, she said, on the understanding that I finish my circuit first, and that the dye works gets proper ventilation installed, and that I'm not expected to give up the river market circuit entirely once I'm settled. Reasonable, I said. All 3. Then yes. She looked at the mark on her wrist again, studying it, the way she'd studied the cloth merchant's packet, the way she studied everything, with a professional and genuine attention. This is very gold, she said, with a note in her voice that was somewhere between wonder and amusement. They usually are. I thought it would look different. She held her wrist out a little, tilting it in the lantern light, like something older, more worn. It's new, I said. It'll settle. She nodded once, accepting this, and lowered her hand. We sat in the inn yard for a while longer. Saren slept on her knee, or pretended to sleep. I could feel the quiet satisfaction radiating off him like warmth off a hearthstone. The market sounds of Thornfeld went on around us, the ordinary evening noise of a river town putting itself to bed, and the lanterns swayed slightly in the ashwater breeze. And neither of us spoke because there was nothing that needed to be said urgently, and we had both learned, apparently, to be comfortable with quiet. Eventually, Aldrich came to the gate of the inn yard, looked at the scene before him, read it accurately, and withdrew without saying anything. I made a note to thank him. I finished the pack register in the morning. Nara packed her equipment and loaded her cart and walked her circuit road south toward Ironhaven, while I rode north toward the hall, and Saren walked beside my horse, with his tail loose and his ears easy, and the general air of a wolf who has completed a significant piece of work. The 3 weeks between Thornfeld and her arrival at Ashvale's hall were longer than I expected them to be, which surprised me. I had been alone, by my own definition, for most of 20 years. I had not known I was capable of missing someone I'd spoken to for a total of perhaps an hour, but I found her in the periphery of things, when I was reviewing the dye works plans with the hall's mason, when the autumn cloth inventory came in and the gray-green bolts were listed, when Saren turned his head toward the southern road and held it there for a few seconds in the way he'd done in Thornfeld. She arrived on a gray morning at the beginning of the frost weeks, her cart stacked with the cauldrons and the rinse barrels and the equipment of her trade, and she came through the hall gate with the directness of someone who has decided and does not reconsider decisions she's already made. Saren met her at the gate and walked beside her to the stable yard, and she put her hand on his head as they went, comfortable and unhurried, as if they'd been doing this for years. She is comfortable with most things, I've learned. Comfortable with the hall's great space, which she looked at once and then began to understand as a practical environment, identifying the light sources and the draft patterns, and the places where the cold came in, and the places where it didn't. Comfortable with the wolves, who came to the courtyard to see her the first morning, and whom she greeted individually, learning their names from the packmaster's list with the same attention she'd given the seedsman's packet. Comfortable with the council, who were not comfortable with her at first. A cloth-dyer with no pack name taking the place of a queen was not what they'd imagined, and who she won, if that is the right word. Not by playing the role they expected, but by being consistently useful in the ways she was actually useful, which turned out to be more ways than they'd anticipated. The dye works renovation took 4 months. She designed the ventilation herself, working with the mason in a language I didn't fully follow but that produced, in the end, a west-facing stone room, with a river inlet below and roof vents above, and a system of raised cauldron stands that she informed me was the most efficient configuration she'd worked with. When it was done, she installed her own cauldrons. I'd arranged for them to be transported with her equipment, and spent the first week seasoning them and testing the river water's mineral content and determining which dyes the Ashvale water suited best. I came by the dye works one afternoon, officially to look at the new ventilation, and found her in the midst of a first run of the gray-green, standing over the largest cauldron with a long stir paddle, and her hair wrapped up against the steam, and the same expression on her face that she'd had studying her own cloth on the Thornfeld drying line, the concentrated, genuine attention of someone who loves their work. She looked up and saw me. "The water here is softer," she said. "The gray-green will come out brighter, different from the river circuit color. Is that good?" "It's different," she said. "I'll have to decide how I feel about it." She stirred. "What do you think about bright gray-green for ceremony cloaks?" "I think that's your decision," I said. "You're the dyer." She looked at me for a second, and then she laughed. The same laugh, the one Saren had heard in the Thornfeld market, the one the pups had followed, and the old wolf had risen for, the one I had almost heard twice before I properly heard it at last in the inn yard. In the dye works it bounced off the stone walls and came back twice as warm, and Saren, who was lying in the doorway with his chin on his paws, lifted his head, and his tail made a single slow sweep across the floor. The mate mark had settled, by then, still gold, but softer. The new mark brightness dimmed to something more permanent. The color of old firelight, steady under the skin. She wears it without covering it. The first time she appeared at council with it visible, one of the older packmasters started to say something, and then stopped himself, and the rest of them simply noted it and moved on. Which was, I thought, the right response. She went back to the river circuit the following spring. I had expected this. We'd agreed to it, in the inn yard, when she'd been deciding. But the expectation and the reality are different things, and I will not pretend the hall wasn't quiet in a particular way the first week she was gone. Saren sat by the southern window more than he had since Thornfeld. I did not say anything about this because there was nothing to say, and also because when she came back 6 weeks later with her cart full of mordant samples and river water jars, and a detailed set of notes on the mineral content of the Ashwater mouth compared to the Ironhaven Reach, the hall stopped being quiet in a particular way that I had not noticed it was capable of. This is, I have come to understand, what Saren knew and I didn't, on that first morning in the Thornfeld market, when his ears tipped south toward the sound of a laugh and held there. He knew that a life can hold things you didn't plan for. That order and duty and the satisfaction of work done well are real goods, not consolations for something better, but that they are also not the whole story. That a man can be genuinely good at ruling a kingdom for 20 years and still have missed something significant, and not know what it is until his wolf points at it. He was patient with me about it. He has always been patient. He is, in his own estimation, clearly the more perceptive of us, and it would be ungracious of me to argue. Last autumn, we went back to the Thornfeld market. Not for the inspection roster, Aldrich handles that now, but for the market itself, which Nara had 3 days of circuit business at, and which I have learned is worth attending for its own sake, aside from the governance. She set up in the dyer's yard and spent the 3 days at her cauldrons with her usual focused ease, and I walked the market and conducted a certain amount of informal diplomacy with the valley packmasters, and Saren walked beside me with his ears easy and his tail loose, no longer pointing south. On the second evening, she came and found me at the low wall of the inn yard. She sat down beside me with the comfortable directness she uses for everything, close enough that her shoulder touched mine, and looked out at the lamplit market. "Do you hear it?" she asked. I listened. The market sounds, the vendors calling the last of the day, the river breeze, the voices of the valley packs settling into evening, and then, from somewhere nearby, a laugh, not hers, someone else's, high and young, a girl somewhere in the crowd finding something delightful. "Yes," I said. She looked at me. "That's what you were chasing, apparently. Not me specifically. Just whatever that is." "I think it was specifically you," I said. "Saren thought so," she said, and I felt rather than heard the smile in it. Saren, at my left side, turned his head toward her and his tail moved once. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her from the middle of the Thornfeld market square with those pale amber eyes, the day I'd finally stopped pretending I didn't know what he was pointing at. She put her hand on his head. He closed his eyes. The market went on around us in its ordinary evening way, warm and purposeful, and the lanterns swayed, and the cloth on the drying lines across the yard moved slightly in the river breeze, deep indigo and madder red, and the bright gray-green that is different from the circuit color, that she decided she felt good about after the second run, and there was nothing else that needed to happen right then, and so nothing happened, and it was enough. Saren heard her laugh before I did. I have never stopped being grateful that one of us knew what to do about it.